Thank you everyone for joining us, and I will pass it over to Rabbi Navarez.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you, at least virtually, and have this opportunity with you tonight. We have a very wonderful conversation to be had. The title of Will COVID Change the Middle East as We Know It is, I would say, is a wonderful set induction for what we have in store tonight. We are blessed to have David Mccoskey and Ambassador Dennis Ross with us, who will lead serving as our moderator. I want to thank Eileen Thatcher, our program director, for putting this wonderful program together, and for David and Dennis's staff for helping on their ends to make this a reality. So a few things just as we begin this evening. We've seen as of late has by the changes that have gone on in Beirut, and we know the response by Israel, certainly layered with a COVID reality. There are discussions at play. We know also, as of yesterday, reading in the paper, see Palestinian opportunities to come into spaces in Israel so that they could have an opportunity to vacation with their wills. And the idea of looking the other way has been something that has taken up time in the press as of late. There are a series of layers, realities that are layered on top of all of what we're discussing tonight. And so Ambassador Dennis Ross and David Mccoskey are really going to help us understand this a little more. So a little bit about who they are, in case you may be new to these wonderful individuals. David Mccoskey is a Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and Director of the Project on Israel Relations. He's an adjunct professor in Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University, the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies, and in 2013 to 14, worked in the Office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Author of numerous Washington Institute monographs and essays on issues related to the Middle East peace process and the Arab-Israeli conflict. He is also co-author Ross of Be Strong and of Good Courage, Israel's most important leaders shaped destiny, and the 2009 Washington Post bestseller, Myths, Illusions, and Peace, Finding a New Direction for America in the Middle East. Before joining the Washington Institute, Mr. Mccoskey was an award-winning journalist who covered the peace process from 1999 to 2000. He's a former executive editor of the Jerusalem Post, diplomatic correspondent for Israel's leading daily publication, Haaretz, and is a former contributing editor to U.S. News and World Report. He is awarded the National Press Club's 1994 Edward M. Hood Award for Diplomatic Correspondence for a story on PLO finances that he co-wrote for the magazine. Ambassador Dennis Ross is Counsel William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. For more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a lead in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process, dealing directly with the parties as the U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. He served 2 years as Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, and is a year as Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Previously, Ambassador Ross doomed to succeed the U.S.-Israel relationship from Obama, which was a phenomenal read. That book was awarded the 2015 National Jewish Book Award for History. He also co-authored the book Peace, Mr. Mccoskey, as I noted, and earlier study The Missing Piece, the inside story of the fight for Middle East peace, which offers analytical and personal insight into the Middle East process. The New York Times praised his publication, Statecraft and How to Restore America's Standing in the World as important and illuminating. So we are privileged and honored to have both of you here this evening. The gentleman that started with some tachlis We have a lot to cover this evening, but I also want to make sure that everybody who's joining us really has a basis of understanding around what we're talking about. So we felt the best way to do that was to illustrate the region, especially when it comes to the West Bank, well, all the West Bank, in terms of areas A, B, and C. So we can all have a visual understanding of what that looks like. I turn this time over to both of them.
Why don't what areas A, B, and C are, where they came from, and then we'll put up the maps, and maybe David can also talk about those as well. So in the areas A, B, and C were created in the 1995 interim agreement. I was the broker that at the time. The issue here was as Israel began to devolve authority to the Palestinians, how would they do it? So they created, the sides agreed to create 3 areas. Area A would be where the would have civil and security responsibility. It would be not quite sovereignty. They would have responsibility for pretty much all the issues that you contend with in that area. Area B would be where they would have civil responsibility for law and order, meaning day-to-day questions of law and order, but Israel would retain overriding responsibility for dealing with terror. And Area C is the area where the Israelis would retain where all the settlements are, but it's much more than that. The original A, B, and involved only Area A, which 2.9% of the West Bank. Area B, another 27%. And then the 3% was basically, the 73% at the time was basically Area C, meaning full Israeli control. When the Wye River Agreement was, the Wye River Memorandum, those and what was only 2 Area A, again, reminding you, that's where Palestinians had control, responsibility for everything civil and security. That went from 2.9% to 18.2%. So basically, almost 1/5 of the territory, which were all basically the municipalities, they became Area A. Area B grew by %. And so the total amount, won't confuse everybody with the numbers, but just so they understand, A and B together are just under 30% of the West Bank. Area C is 60% of the West Bank. So there is a reality where the Palestinians have either total responsibility or partial responsibility in about 40%, and the Israelis have responsibility for 60%. Now, again, to be clear, during the course of Intifada, the Israelis, in the end, after bombings within Israel, went into area and basically destroyed a lot of the terrorist infrastructure that had been developed there. Even today, the Israelis will, from time to time, go into Area A if there are threats of terror that they. Now, when they do that, they tend to coordinate with the Palestinian Authority. Now, we're in a different situation where security coordination has been greatly backed by the Palestinian Authority because they have been anticipating the Israelis to annex part of the territory allotted to it under the Trump peace plan. That actually has happened. We can talk about that. There's very little discussion of annexation. Prime Minister Netanyahu says that's a decision to be made, suggesting that it's out of his hands, that it's up to the Trump administration. That in itself is an interesting kind of evolution because where focus before was this was something he was going to go ahead and do. Again, so just so people understand, Area A, Palestinians retain, in a sense, total responsibility. Area B is where they have partial responsibility. Areas the Israelis have complete responsibility. Just one last word on this. There is some discussion or even dialogue, even dispute over how many Palestinians actually live in Area C. It's the least populated of the areas. The A and B together probably represent of the Palestinian population. That's where the Palestinians have, either near total or all responsibility. 5% of the Palestinian population is in Area C. Some discussion because the numbers there may be a little bit squishy. The number would be around 100,000. So the vast majority A and B.
Thank you, Ambassador. We can have some visuals, some mapping here?
Okay.
David,
Yeah,
is that possible?
so can you hear me okay? So look,
Yes.
I know I don't want to give people a headache. Dennis laid out really nicely. But I just want to zoom out as we zoom in on Zoom. The zooming out is the idea of Oslo. The idea of Oslo was the first time people saw that 1993 of the handshake, Rabin and Arafat, with Clinton orchestrating it in the backdrop. And the idea was this was the first time in 100 years that the two national liberation movements of both Zionism and the Palestinians actually met and agreed on the idea of partition, dividing the land that was needed to be shared. But what sort of sharing, how to share, in what ways? That was the Oslo idea, was to say, okay, we have to work it out. We agree to the principle that the two nationalist movements have to share. But how to share, we haven't figured out. The idea of gradualism was to say, toughest issues. The tough issues are ones that everyone knows. Jerusalem is hard. Refugees is hard. And disarrangements is hard. And the idea was, by having follow-on agreements from 1993 and onward, the idea was that the parties would find a way to take these incremental steps. But you see from the map, green is area A, and the light green is the B area that Dennis mentioned. Everything that's not dark green or light green is area C. So dark green is Palestinian urban areas. B is near the urban areas where the Palestinians, and the rest of the 60%, they felt we got to figure that out later. But the concept, and just in stroke, was the idea of that he agreed to begin this process, because people said, okay, Palestinian urban obviously should be run by the Palestinians. And but the tougher issues. What about the Jordan Valley? That's to the east, and we'll talk about that. And that comes up a lot in the Trump plan. Or what about the area around Jerusalem? That's tough with it. But the easier parts were these like checkerboard squares. Now you say, well, what's the red? I don't get the red. What's that red thing? The red thing came about later, actually, in 2003, when there were all these explosions. And the idea was that Israel will build a security barrier, because most of the settlers, I should say, is between what's known as the green line, the pre-67 border, and that barrier that was set up to stop suicide bombers from coming in. So they were all in Area C, which was to be discussed down the road. The idea of Camp David in 2000 was, okay, we started this gradualism A, B, and C. Now, can we just solve the conflict? That was tried by Bill Clinton in 2000. That was tried by Condoleezza Rice in 2007-8. And that was tried by Secretary of State Kerry, who I worked for, in 2013 and 14, to get beyond the checkerboard square and to come up with a final border. But these were the key incremental things. And if we could go to one slide more, that I always want to simplify, even though it's a complicated subject. But look at this slide here, where people lived. And you heard from Dennis, people say, you and Dennis, you've been at this, you haven't given up on two states, because our main point, if you remember one sentence from this, is that we're looking, where does demography meet geography in the West Bank? Where do people actually live? And what we find is that most of the Israeli settlers, 77% of them live inside what Israel calls the fence. Palestinians call it a wall. We use a more neutral term, the barrier. And that is in about 8% of the West Bank, closest to Israeli urban areas because they work in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, doctors, lawyers, accountants, everything. So most of the Israelis live inside the barrier, and most of the Palestinians, 95%, live outside the barrier. Now, if you add East Jerusalem, the Israeli number of 77% goes up to 84. But what you see is that most of the Israelis live inside that barrier close to Israeli urban areas, and most of the Palestinians live outside it. So A, B, and C and the barrier are building blocks to understand that we still think two states are possible. So I'm sorry for a lot of detail, A, B, C, but I hope you'll just remember demography meets geography. Most of the Israeli settlers live inside the barrier. Most of the Palestinians live outside it. So we don't know if there's political will, but our argument is there's certainly a way, if there was the will, to reach these two states based on this building block.
Can I just add one point to what David said? And this just sort of, I'm going to use a terminology that we have used for a long time. Going back to the Camp David Summit, before we went there, we actually came up with the idea of settlement blocks. For the very reason that the numbers that David just showed you reflect. We knew we had to adjust the border because the Green Line or June 467 didn't make sense from a security standpoint, and it didn't make sense from a demographic standpoint. There was no way you were going to move all the Israeli settlers out of there. So we came up with the concept of, all right, let's absorb, at that time we said, let's absorb about 80% of the Israeli settlers, and they mostly live in these blocks because that's the way they settled. They moved there not for ideological, but for economic reasons, quality of life reasons. Let's absorb roughly 80% of the settlers, what are known as settlement blocks, and that territory, which may be anywhere from 5 to 7%, there'll then be compensation to ends with territorial. If you hear the term settlement blocks and swaps, that's what it refers to. When you hear David and I talk about building within block areas consistent with the two-state outcome, block areas is not. That's what we mean. When they talk about demography, geography, here you absorb Israelis in a way that is consistent, separating Israelis from Palestinians. Two states for two separation. What we've just done is outlined not only A, B, and C, but also the and swaps.
Thank you. Very important, I think, for all of us to be on the page here, so I appreciate both of your detailed explanation. But we know that many conversations and attempts have been made to broker peace, and both of you have had your role in part of those conversations. A little bit more about what's new here with the Trump plan. What are we looking at today that has similarities, differences? We're curious to know.
Do you want me to start or do you want to do it, David? You want me to start? All right, so let me start and say following. It's a very good question in light of what I was just saying. One profound difference from the Trump plan from everything that came before. All previous plans, premise of what I was referring to, absorb the settlement of Israel, and the rest of the territory outside the blocks will make up a Palestine state. What the Trump plan does is it not only absorbs all of the settlements within the block areas, which is 55, it absorbs all the settlements outside of the block area. What makes it difficult to create separation is when you have to accommodate not blocks, but all the settlements outside, even though the settlements outside only 15% of the settler population, you make it difficult. So the most significant difference of the Trump plan from every previous proposal is not that you absorb some of the settlements, it's that all the previous were geared only towards the settlement block so you could actually ensure separation. The Trump plan is geared on the premise that you're going to absorb all of the settlements, including very small, including the enclaves within the Palestinian state itself. Now, there are another 63 that absorb, they're not within the Palestinian state. The Palestinian state put a way to accommodate the existence of those 63. And frankly, for Arab leaders who might have been more sympathetic to the Trump plan. The problem with the Trump plan, and we can show it on the map, is that it's hard to create any kind of continuity for a Palestinian state. Not only is it broken up, but in addition, what you'll see is that it's also surrounded. The Trump plan means that the Jordan Valley is absorbed into Israel. All previous proposals would not have absorbed the Jordan Valley into Israel. The Jordan Valley makes certain that if the Israelis control it, that Israel completely surrounds what would be the Palestinian state. If you're a Palestinian, you want to go anywhere, you have to go through Israel. If you're a Palestinian, you want to be able to trade anything, Israel determines what comes in and out of the Palestinian state. In previous proposals, one of the things we sought to do was allow there to be a practical arrangement where Israeli security needs would be met, but the Palestinian political and symbolic needs would be met, so that, for example, in a back channel that I worked on during the Obama administration, we came up with the idea of a 100-year lease, that the Israelis would lease the Jordan Valley for 100 years. So Palestinians, in a sense, would say it's our territory, but we're leasing it to the Israelis. And then to create a parallelism, we had the Palestinians leasing territory within Israel. They were going to lease, they could lease part of the Ashdod port. They could lease part of Ben Gurion Airport. They could lease an area next to Haifa for a desalinization plant. So the idea here was, how do you meet the symbolic needs of the Palestinians, but also the practical needs of the Israelis? The Trump plan, by absorbing all of the settlements, makes separation difficult, and by having Israeli sovereignty in the Jordan Valley, makes the symbolism on the Palestinian side difficult to reach. Very hard to reach an agreement if you're not addressing the needs of both sides. And I would say part of the problem with the Trump plan is that even those Arab leaders who were inclined to look for a way out, to be responsive, who have become fatigued with the Palestinians, couldn't look at the map and say, gee, that looks like it's creating a state. And so, in a sense, I think that's what explains the fundamental difference between the Trump plan and all previous ones that were developed. What was developed with the Clinton parameters, which was a bridging proposal between the two sides, and I was mostly responsible for drafting. What was done during the Bush administration, although the Bush administration didn't make a proposal, Ehud Olmert did make a proposal, and what was done with the principles that President Obama presented to Mahmoud Abbas on March 17, 2014. All of those proposals looked very different than the Trump plan, because they were based on settlement blocks and swaps, and because they were based on the principle of reconciling practical needs with political needs.
I'll just add, look, just again, for people looking at the map, so anything purple would be Israel under the Trump plan. So as we've been talking about blocks inside the barrier, and we talked about that red line where the barrier is, that's all on the left side of your screen. So anything purple is kind of much more traditionalist approach of the last several administrations that Dennis just outlined, because we believe that most of these settlers live near the pre-67 lines, and it's consistent with two states. So as Dennis pointed out, that's kind of the more traditional part. The part on the right side of your screen, the purple there, is the Jordan Valley. And Israel's concern about the Jordan Valley, you need to understand too. It goes back to the 48 war, the 67 war, where there were attacks from Iraq and Jordan. But there's now been a peace treaty with Jordan, and now Jordan and Israel patrol the Jordan Valley together on each side of the border, and to make sure that there's no materiel that's smuggled in or radical forces. So I think the security establishment people like the idea of Israel having control there, but they don't think Israel needs to annex it. And what the Trump says, no, it's not enough that Israel controls it, we want Israel to annex. So Israel's on the right, Israel's on the left. You see everything in the middle, in that gray area, everything yellow, light yellow, would be Palestinian villages in a future state of Palestine. But as Dennis pointed out, Israel's in the north, Israel's in the south, Israel's in the east, and Israel's in the west. So Israel will decide who goes in and who goes out, and Israel will have overriding security in this area. The Palestinians say this doesn't look like a state to us, and they've rejected it. So our concerns, Dennis and I, are all about always, where does demography meet geography? How can you get the most settlers in an area that is geographically coherent and enables separation? Because our wider fear is one state for two peoples. Our fear is, what if you cannot separate these peoples anymore? If the Palestinians say, you know what, forget it. This doesn't look like a state. You want all 130 settlements, not just the 52 inside the barrier. You know what? It's all one state. And then our fear is that this will change the paradigm for Palestinians to say, you know what? It's not about land anymore. It's about rights. We want to vote in Israel's election. And that might sound fanciful. If you're living in San Diego or in Bethesda or Maryland or wherever you are, but we think if they give up, then that changes the paradigm in our country, in the United States. That people will say, hey, our DNA is one person, one vote. What's wrong with that? So it isn't Jewish state anymore, but it'll be democratic. Now, our view is that Israel's not about to disband. It's ethos of its founders, the twin wings of the Zionist aircraft have been both Jewish and democratic. It's not one at the expense of the other. So we are concerned about the geography, not because we're wondering where does the land, where does the line go, but we're worried if you can't separate these people anymore. As they say, from an egg Shimon Peres famously said, from an egg you can make an omelet, but from an omelet you can't make an egg. If they're not geographically distinct, our fear is that the debate shifts in this country. Maybe not tomorrow morning, but we're seeing it on college campuses. Dennis and I go to a lot of college campuses, and we're seeing that debate shift, and we're seeing people, frankly, at the fringes of the political spectrum in the United States. And our fear is that these fringe people become more mainstream if people say you can't get to two states anymore. It's one state for two people. Now, just be careful the term one state because it's used both by people who are rejectionists on both sides. It's used by Hamas to say one state. They think the whole area should be Muslim. It's used by settlers, and we're not comparing all the settlers, obviously, with Hamas. No, there's no moral equivalent between a bomb and a bulldozer, of course. They say one state, all controlled by Israel. But so everyone uses the term one state, but they mean very different things. Our fear is that the tone shifts in the United States, and that's why we wrote this book, because we felt there were leaders who made historic decisions because they understood the importance of land and demographics since the beginning of Zionism. And they felt the national responsibility. Ben-Gurion says in 48 war, I could have taken the West Bank, but I wanted to remain a Jewish country. So we think that the geography matters because it's linked up to a broader debate about Israel's very identity that we care very much about.
So I think you just layer this with the response of those in the United States, and that there's in our Jewish literature, we call this Merasayan, right? The perception. We have the perceived reality. And so here we're talking about what could be perceived if a one-state solution were to become reality, that there could be backlash among those who support or from the fringes. And so I think you just enlightened us with a very important piece. I want to move us a little bit to the realities of COVID in the region, because I think that is an incredible challenge that has plagued the region and the world, obviously. We're all living it. I think they're living it differently in the region. First is realities that Israel had really gotten hold of, or seemingly had gotten hold of the virus, and then opened up very quickly after, and now is really dealing with a resurgence of it. And we first saw it in their schools, and then it became more prevalent. So the one thing is, how do you explain this in terms of what's going on there right now with the response to COVID, and how does it play out within the context of the region? I'm going to add another piece to this to make it more complex. We have Iran that is knocking down its proxies' doors to try to get into the bastion of evil known as Israel, and they are trying to do this while COVID is rampant there as well. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts about all of these pieces, because I think there's a synergy between them. So love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, so let me just make one point with our previous discussion, and we'll get into it. Bear in mind everything David was saying. What will happen with the Palestinians if one state is the only thing that's out there is they'll say, fine, one person,
What time is there?
one state, one person, one vote. Everybody, the idea that they would be denied the vote in a circumstance where all they're asking for is equality and one state is the only issue. Hard to believe that isn't going to have a resonance here as well. All right, so let's talk about COVID and its impact in the region. I think we can look at it at several different levels. One, Israel, at least initially, as you said, they didn't flatten the curve, they crushed the curve. But they became, I think, too complacent too quickly. One thing we know about this virus, it doesn't go away. It's there. So if you restore the kind of behavior you had prior to the virus, then you're going to see a resurgence, which is exactly what's happened in Israel. They resumed not only economic activity too quickly, they didn't phase in the opening of the schools. They didn't stop big events from taking place. And in a sense, they went from having literally 7 or 8 new cases a day. In the last week, they had several days where they had 2,000 new cases a day. They've been averaging now between 1,200 and 1,400 new cases a day. They went from less than 200 who had died to now 600 who have died. And they have a capacity for 400 in hospitals, for 800 who are seriously ill in hospitals. They're not there yet, but there's a stress there. So even a country like Israel that is very good in terms of a strong communal sense of responsibility, very good in terms of being able to do tracing and tracking, very good in terms of its medical facilities and what is offered to very broadly to the public. It now is under great stress, and you have about 25% of the population that's unemployed. There's a great deal of anger as a result of that within the country. Israel went from being a country that really looked like it had it under control now to really struggling. They've appointed someone who's supposed to be the czar of managing this, we'll see. I mean, at least in the last week, the numbers went down from 2,000 a day, as I said, to more like to between 1,200 and 1,400. That's not good, but it's better than where they were. How about the rest of the region? You said correctly that Iran seems to be practicing a policy much like Sweden's, which is, just don't close down. You'll deal with by getting herd immunity. Herd immunity means 60% of the population has to have it. Well, that's fine. It's almost like survival of the fittest. And Iran just denies how many people actually have it. Although interesting enough, you actually had the president of Iran suddenly say there were 25 million who had it. So it's, that's not what they have formally admitted, but what it suggests is this is a very, very rampant problem within Iran. It hasn't changed their behavior on the outside, but one other thing to note about Iran, it is a failed model, but everywhere where it has a presence in the region or where it's sought to extend itself, they also are failing. Look at Lebanon. We can discuss what's happened with Lebanon after the horrendous explosion there. Even before that, Lebanon was turning into a failed state. This was a country that always had a very vibrant middle class. That middle class has disappeared, has become impoverished. Banks don't allow you to withdraw more than $100, but the level of corruption within the fiefdoms who manage Lebanon politically, with Hezbollah having a stranglehold over them, they were able to get billions out of the country while the average person couldn't withdraw $100 out of their banks. So there is the problems within Lebanon are monumental. We're in what looks like a revolutionary situation there. In Iraq, obviously, the circumstances are very difficult. The loss in oil income because of the decline in oil prices, even though they've gone up a little bit from where they were, they're still they're at $40 a barrel as opposed to before they were up to 60. Iraq doesn't have enough revenue to pay the people within their government. They basically are paying them at a half-time basis now. So they're struggling. Obviously, Syria is a country still consumed by war, but also pretty much a collapsed economy. And there's no place where the Iranians have established a presence where you can look and say, gee, they're doing well. And that's not lost on those in the region. But that doesn't mean everyone else in the region is doing great. And here are some of the things that I think one needs to be concerned about. The oil-rich countries have lost $270 billion in revenue, given the decline of oil revenues. Now, why is that significant, apart from the potential impact it has within those countries? Because the big oil producers, like Saudi Arabia, which is the biggest, and then the UAE and Kuwait, they were the countries who always bailed out Egypt and Jordan. When they faced real economic straits, they could count on being bailed out by Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Kuwait. Well, they can't count on being bailed out now because those countries aren't flush with the cash that they had before. It's not just that they don't have the money to bail out. Both Egypt and Jordan exported labor to the Arabian Peninsula countries. And the labor they exported then sent remittances back. In the case of both Egypt and Jordan, that accounted for about 10% of their revenues and budgets. So you're looking at what is a very potentially difficult circumstance for both Egypt and Jordan. Egypt is a country of 100 million. And their ability to get through this and getting help from the outside to manage it economically, even assuming they get beyond where they are in terms of COVID. And here I'd say there's a distinction between Egypt and Jordan. Jordan has done a very good job of controlling COVID, but they have 50% unemployment. And Egypt has not done as good. They too have very high, especially youth unemployment. So that's a combustible mixture. And so I think we should be anticipating the potential for increasing instability in the coming months unless we get beyond COVID soon enough, unless there's enough help from the IMF and the World Bank and from other donor countries to help these countries get through it at a time when the normal assistance they would get from the Gulf oil states is not going to be forthcoming.
I would just add, Dennis gave a very nice regional overview. You know, we're still in the eye of the storm. And when you're in the eye of the storm, you don't always have great visibility beyond the storm. It's often the crystal ball is a bit foggy. So we always have to be humble. But we know generally in history that when there's a seismic earthquake going on, we know that there's aftershocks. And, in our own country, we looked at the Depression, and then we saw that the political landscape shifted very quickly as a result of that seismic earthquake. In Israel, we know with the 73 war, it wasn't a natural disaster, it wasn't 20% unemployed, but it wasn't an immediate earthquake. But we know that, by the 1977 elections, labor lost, and they have not really come back to power since 1977, except for 10 of the last 43 years. 33 of 43 years, the political party who was seen as not doing a good job during the crisis lost power and virtually had a very hard time ever coming back. So we need a certain humility that we can't always see exactly what are the political implications of COVID. We do know, for example, that the president of Israel today, Reuven Rivlin, gave a speech where he said the public would not forgive the idea of going to a fourth election during the COVID crisis. And we see how COVID has sucked all the oxygen out of the room. We have been talking about annexation before, but annexation disappeared. The public just wants to know one thing: are we safe? That's all they want to know. Can I send my kids to school? Is that okay? And Israel, I think now per capita, now I would argue in the non-democratic world, I don't think the numbers in Iran are any good, or in a lot of these countries. So I don't really, that Israel is now the highest number of per capita people cases. That doesn't mean the highest number of hospitalizations. It certainly doesn't mean the highest number of deaths per capita, but the highest number of cases. That has implications, and the public is judging its leadership right now. Is it handling topic A? And if you talk about anything that's not topic A, they don't want to hear about it. So it should concentrate the mind of the politicians. We got to get topic A right. We got to get COVID right. But we don't know, what's going to be. We don't, in Lebanon, I mean, the idea that there would be this, a failed state, as Dennis pointed out correctly. People thought they don't have COVID under control. Then they have this massive blast in Beirut of something the country never saw. And what's fascinating is the old style conspiracy theories don't work anymore. And this is something that I think people should draw a little comfort from if they're sitting in San Diego, California, wherever they are, wherever you may be sitting watching this, is the old Middle East. They had something called the Mu'amara, the conspiracy. Everything was a conspiracy. It wouldn't take enough. It wouldn't take a lot to say Israel is behind this attack on the ammonium nitrate. And guess what? Nobody believes that there. And if you see there's riots going on in Beirut, there's pictures of Hassan Nasrallah, who has Iranian weapons, being hung in effigy. There's one of the TV networks, anchors, just said yesterday, we will do no more interviews with Hassan Nasrallah and put him on our air. Now, I still don't count his Hezbollah guns. I don't count them out. In the Middle East, if you fire the shots, you could call the shots. But what's fascinating is the old style conspiracy theories that have governed the Middle East, that it's always the fault of the Jews. It's always the fault of the Zionists. It's not going over in Lebanon. And the social media there is showing pictures of the Tel Aviv City Hall that in the middle of COVID in Israel has a Lebanese flag. I mean, it brought me almost to tears to see the humanity, the fact that Israel could identify with human suffering. And what that tells me is that the Lebanese people are saying, I see dysfunction of our banks, I see corruption, I see the inability of our government to handle COVID. I don't believe you guys anymore with your conspiracy theories. I believe my eyes, and I believe, Hezbollah put that ammonium nitrate there, and we're going to hold our own government accountable, and the government just resigned. So what I'm wondering is, and we're still in the middle, and we have to be humble. We don't know for sure, but what we're seeing is that we're in the middle of the storm, and a lot of the old perceptions might not hold true anymore, and we'll just have to see how it plays out. But it'll be interesting to see if COVID is a precursor for much more broader change in the Middle East.
So you're talking about the idea of a geopolitical new world order, in a sense, a new world, not order, but a thinking. New ideologies coming out of this COVID era, which are interesting. You also mentioned corruption, which brings me to another question. And I think it's off of the annexation, tied into everything going on right now. So we know that COVID may have a serious impact on annexation. This is a question that the decision is still political. And so if Netanyahu, who we know is a major proponent of annexation, is found guilty and removed from office, will the desire for annexation still prevail, COVID or not?
Well, first of all, let's put in perspective, the Netanyahu trial will resume in December. The judges there have mandated that it will meet 3 times a week, starting in January. I do think Prime Minister Netanyahu is very concerned about that, concerned that there'll be a petition brought to the Supreme Court to say that, look, he will need to take a leave during that time, because how can he be the Prime Minister with that much time having to be devoted to his defense? One of the reasons I think we've seen so much discussion about elections is that he may see a 4th election as a way of avoiding that. If in fact he's able to put together a narrow-based government that will vote immunity. Now, the irony is there were 3 elections, and in none of those 3 elections was he able to get to 61 with the right. And it would seem to be a huge gamble for him to think that in an election in November with President Rivlin saying today, you know, how outrageous it would be to go to a 4th election. And the polls show that a majority would blame Netanyahu if there was such an election. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen. We may yet see this was a bluff. We may yet see him, you know, continue to press for, you know, he wants a 1-year budget. The coalition agreement that he signed on to said there had to be a 2-year budget. Gantz and Blue White are standing firm on that. We'll see what happens. I mean, Dave was talking about being humble. One needs to be humble when it comes to predicting Israeli politics and Israeli elections, especially when we've had 3 in such a short period of time. I never thought that Israel would try to rival Italy in terms of the number of elections, but they're doing a pretty good job right now. And we'll see. But at a minimum, even if Netanyahu's trial begins in earnest 3 days a week, it won't be over right away. And the issue of annexation, if we have, you know, no one knows what's going to happen here, but if there were a change in administration, you would have an administration that rejects the idea of unilateral annexation, sees it as inconsistent with promoting peace, but also more importantly, sees it inconsistent with being able to preserve the possibility of 2 states. So it's clear that Netanyahu all along was believing that if he was to do this, he needed to do it while Trump was president. So the window on this could be closing in part because, in a sense, he needs to be seen as dealing with COVID right now, not annexation. And it's, you know, and he's not going to be in a position where things are going to dramatically improve in Israel right away. So he has to decide, is he going to do that or not? If he's actually going to go for an election, it might be important to the right wing for him to say he's going to do annexation, but they won't accept him saying it. He'll have to do it. And here again, right now, he's the position in the coalition agreement was it was up to the United States had to agree to it, and we'll have to see. What Netanyahu said today in an interview was the President Trump isn't focused on it. The decision, the issue is to be decided in Washington, and he's not focused on it because he has COVID. So I would say that the COVID is kind of, at this point, overwhelmed the issue of annexation. It doesn't mean it's gone, but it certainly has been submerged. And if it were to be put off until after our election, and Trump were not to win, then it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to go ahead with annexation because you'd have a United States not recognizing it. Israel would gain very little from that, but it would produce a lot of hostility internationally. So I would say the window is closing on it, and while it's not closed yet, it certainly looks much less likely than it did before.
I would just add just a little caveat. I mean, I mostly agree with what Dennis said. I would just bring 2 scenarios to think about. As Dennis said, the key point here is that Netanyahu wanted to extricate annexation from the American presidential season, you know, starting Labor Day. That's why he wanted it as soon as he could. With the new government was only formed in May, so he said July 1st. Then it didn't happen amid all the opposition, including coming from the security establishment of Israel and retired generals who saw this brought no strategic advantage to Israel. And it's also, you know, it could hurt the good news in the Middle East. People always want to know what are the good news in the Middle East has been the strategic convergence of Israel and the Gulf states. Dennis and I have both traveled to the Persian Gulf and over the year, and Dennis has been in Riyadh, I've been in Abu Dhabi and Bahrain, and they all say to us the same thing. We don't know what America's going to do, but we know there's one country that cannot allow Iran to, you know, to spread its hegemonic aspirations in this region, and that's Israel. So it's not your mother's or father's Middle East anymore. It's that Israel and the Arab states are working together. I don't want to overstate this. Certainly the security people are, and some of the technology people are. Don't want to overstate it, but it's a very promising opportunity. And people are saying, you know, you got a good thing going, don't mess it up. So in the main, I think Netanyahu's finding there's more opposition than he thought. And so I think it's down, but not out. What are two scenarios that I think you should think about is, and you know, Dennis and I want to avoid partisanship at all costs here. As analysts, we are wondering though, at what point does President Trump, if he, you know, he's down by 15 points now in the polls, does he think it would energize his evangelical base? Now we're hearing from that the White House is kind of surprised by that the reaction of second generation evangelicals is not as supportive. And that's a fascinating development. But if Trump said, look, I'm down by 15, I want to go for it, you know, I don't think Bibi's going to say no to Donald Trump, who wants to go for it. So that's scenario one. So while I think his window is closing, Trump's window might not yet have closed. The second one, which I think is lower probability, and rationally you would say this doesn't make sense, but it is the Middle East, and Kissinger's maxim that all politics, you know, Israel doesn't have a foreign policy, it is domestic politics, or Tip O'Neill's line of all politics is local. What's happening now is that Netanyahu is facing a right wing of Naftali Bennett's party that has really done very well, ironically, not by focusing on annexation, but by talking about the shortcomings of Corona, of the government performance on Corona. In the last poll, he was at about 18, 19 seats, which is unheard of. And it's all coming at Netanyahu's expense. So in theory, the door on annexation, the window should be closed, you know, if Trump loses on November 3rd. But I think a wrinkle to think about, even though Dennis is right, that, you know, if Biden is president and he says, I don't recognize this annexation, what is it worth? But if Netanyahu is going to have a fourth election and his biggest rival is coming to him from the right, he might say, I'll deal with Biden later. I trust his gut. We could find a common thing. But the politics is I have to get as many votes as I can, and I cannot let the Bennett party outflank me. I wouldn't put it past the prime minister to adopt a policy that, even though in terms of U.S.-Israel relations, which he's cared a lot about, and you're talking to two people that are certainly not Netanyahu haters, we know that he's done some great things for Israel. But at the same time, I'm worried that the domestic political imperative of a fourth election, if it happens, will create a new dynamic that he will feel that I have to say I'm doing this because of the challenge from the right. That's another reason why this fourth election, in my view, should not happen, because Israel's topic A should be Corona, Corona, Corona. But anyway, this is just a scenario to think about.
But I just reinforce the point that David made. If you see the fourth election, then it means for sure the window on annexation doesn't close. Bibi will have to do that, just given the politics of the right. And the far right doesn't care about his being indicted. You know, if it's a choice between their ideology and being able to annex, they're going to annex. And if it means giving Bibi immunity to be able to do it, they're going to do it. So if the prospect of a fourth election is the best single indicator, then annexation is still on the table.
That's great. That's great.
So I'm aware of our time, and I just want to bring 2 or 3 questions to you before we start to wrap up. One is it's a fascinating discussion. This is going to diverge a little bit from our focus here, but it's still all, I think, important for us to understand. So one of the hot button issues is the recent actions in Congress that none of the $38 billion in security aid that was given to Israel can be used for annexation. And will this action have any impact on Israel?
Well, it wasn't adopted. It was a resolution that does not have in the Senate, that does not have, it didn't get voted, and because there weren't votes for it. So the short answer is no, it's not going to have an impact, but it should be a wake-up call, because one of the senators who sponsored it has been a mainstream Democrat, not someone who's coming from the progressive wing of the party, not someone who has been anything but a supporter of Israel, Chris Van Hollen of our state, where David and I live in Maryland. He's been a very strong supporter of Israel, and yet he was basically the drafter of this resolution, which gives you a sense of how annexation plays here. You know, it's here, it splits the Jewish community. It gives real fuel and political tailwind to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party that views Israel through a very different lens than certainly the centrists in the party and those who actually are the most significant players in the Congress. A majority of the Democrats who sit in Congress remain strong supporters of Israel, don't see Israel through the lens of being a victimizer and the Palestinians as being the victims. But there is a wing, a small number, that see it differently, and annexation will certainly provide them political tailwind were it to happen. And this should be, as I said, for Israelis and for Prime Minister Netanyahu, this should be a wake-up call. If someone like Chris Van Hollen would author a resolution like this, which honestly I think makes no sense. Because it's not if you're saying Israel can't use it, in the areas that are annexed, or can't use it for its defense. So if Hamas starts firing rockets into Israel, because they said, we're doing it because of annexation, what, Israel can't respond to that? That's absurd on its face. So, what the people who want to delegitimize Israel want to do internationally is they want to deny Israel the ability to defend itself. They will continue to look for opportunities to try to constantly put Israel in the docket. They know they're not going to undermine the state overnight, but they want to start by making it impossible for Israel to defend itself. One of the interesting things David made a reference to, one thing to watch for in Lebanon, will there be not just pressure on Hezbollah in general, but will there be pressure on Hezbollah to take the weapons out of the houses? Hezbollah has basically put weapons in houses. I was in the north, and I was walked through one of the tunnels. The Israelis discovered 6 over a kilometer-long tunnels that Hezbollah had dug. And the Israelis kept one open to show, for investigating purposes, but also to show people from outside what Hezbollah had done. The other 5, the only way they could destroy them was by bringing in 600 trucks per tunnel to pour in liquid cement. They showed me the video of the liquid cement. They poured it in, and where did it come out? It came out on the other side in a house, flowing out of a house. So here's Hezbollah, who claims that, they had nothing to do with the ammonium nitrate. But everyone in Lebanon knows where they put weapons. So will this disaster, will this shine a spotlight on that? Will it create pressure on that? Can it affect them there? That's something else to be watching.
So I have a few questions, but we're not going to have time for them. So I'm going to give you one question here, which is, what are your thoughts on the Palestinians never proposing a deal themselves? And so coupled with that is, what do you believe the future is for the PA post-Abbas?
Okay, I'll start, and Dennis will then take a crack at it. I would just say, look, there's a reason why Dennis and I are the gradualist school, because we know, and some of you guys know me, know I'm a big baseball fan, and we tried 3 times to hit the home run on this issue. I think all with good, noble intentions. Efforts, Bill Clinton, Dennis was the spearhead of that in 2000. Condoleezza Rice, 2007-8 with Olmert and Abbas. I was part of the 3rd effort with Kerry in 2013-14. I was involved in it, so maybe I'm not objective. I think these were noble efforts to hit the home run ball. But whenever you hit the home run ball, there's a chance you strike out. And for me, a date that I will never forget is March 17th, 2014, when Abbas was in the Oval Office and said, President Obama said, well, we want an answer to what we've been working on. He said, I'll be back to you in a week. And he never got back. And my conclusion, just as they couldn't solve it during these other two times is that he cannot make these final compromises because he doesn't want to be written, I think, in the Arab history books by what did he give away in history to Israel. So, you know, I think it's whenever it's all or nothing in the Mideast, it's nothing. So, and the Venn diagram for us doesn't overlap between Abbas and Netanyahu. So I think, you know, Einstein's line about insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting, you know, a different result. I don't think you could do a fourth, you know, effort to hit the home run ball with this leadership that we see now. But there's no reason not to try to hit a solid single, to do something that is attainable, that would get the publics on both sides not to have this profound sense of disbelief that anything is possible. It used to be that there was a majority still on each side for two states, but then you ask the follow-on question, but does the other side want it? No. So is it possible? No. Now we don't even have the majority on each side for two states. And so we need to get the public from the grandstands kind of on the playing field. We got to get them to believe again. They're not going to believe any speeches, but what's a solid single, in my view, is what I call, you know, the Kishka test, which is what do they really, really care about? On the Palestinian side, it's land. They want to know, okay, you say I should defer some of these issues, but by deferring them, am I conceding them? And there is no two-state solution. And that's why we spent so much time on where does demography meet geography, to tie this all together in a bow tie from the beginning of our discussion is, okay, you say I should defer, but I want to know, I'm not shutting the door to my rights for two states. So the land is the Kishka issue for Palestinians. And we think the blocks and swaps issues that we talked about, Dennis and myself, within the barrier means you don't build outside it because you're leaving that door open, even if you can't solve all the problems now. But anyway, such a large majority of the settlers live inside the blocks, inside the barrier. It shouldn't make that much of a difference. That's the solid single. Now, what do the Israelis care about? And the Jewish history tells you when your enemies say they want to do terrible things, you got to believe them. So I think the Kishka concern of the Israeli Jews is very fair. And that is to say, you know, are you going to give money to relatives of perpetrators of violence? You know, it could be suicide bombers, it could be other forms of perpetrators. When you give money to their relatives at 3 times the national average, what you're saying is there's an incentive for violence. And we've seen the Shin Bet thwart attacks where they've interrogated the attacker and said, why did you do this attack? And said, I knew that if I would do an attack, my family would have triple the amount, you know, they would be taken care of. And so the solid single for Jews and for Israel is, don't give money to these people that sends a message that it pays to slay. And I think if you start there, it doesn't mean you end there. You could do other things, more Area C, economic access. There's a lot of things that could be done. But I think if we try to achieve less, but we succeed, we don't set the home run ball as the only objective, and then we strike out. But if we try to achieve less, but we attain it and maybe even surpass it, then I feel we could break out of the all or nothing straitjacket that has plagued this issue for so long. So I think the fact that Abbas can't do the grand deal should not be an excuse to do incremental moves that are possible, that could deepen the security cooperation that exists between the two countries, which is crucial for the Israeli security establishment. And I'll just say on that one word, you know, people say, Dennis and you, how do you guys keep at it? Well, part of the reason we keep at it is we see the good stuff that you guys don't see. We see the security cooperation. We see the convergence of interest to keep Hamas out of the West Bank. And so we think there's values for Israel's security. If you care about Israel's security, you want something gradual. But to set the bar so high and fail, I think is in nobody's interest.
So do you have time? Oh, do you want to answer, Dennis? I'm sorry.
I'm just going to add very briefly, pick up on what David was saying at the end. It's not just what we see with the Palestinians, it's also what David was referring to earlier. There is a very different landscape out there strategically because of the convergence of interests of the Sunni Arab leaderships with Israel. They see Israel as the main bulwark not only against the Iranians, the Shia militias, but also against the Sunni Islamists, ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood. So that's not going to disappear. And that too can be used not as a substitute for the Palestinians, but to create a cover for the Palestinians. And it can create a basis for doing something differently. And that, you know, I like to say, I always feel like I have to pass out antidepressants at the end of one of these discussions. So it's always good for us to end with something that shows you that there is a possibility of hope, and there is a potential for real change. Some of the change may be more instability in the region, but some of the change may be revolutionary in a more positive direction. We'll have to see. The Middle East doesn't normally make you into an optimist, but what it should do is make you into a realist who never gives up.
And that's why, you know, I know people are so used to being depressed at these sessions on Israel and the Middle East. We want you to go back to your spouses, to your grandchildren, to anyone, and to say, hey, you know what? There's good news out there. I didn't know it. And that the Israel's best relationships are with the Arab security counterparts throughout the Arab world, not in every Arab state, but in many. And it's remarkable. It's, you know, the last several years. So this gives us hope to believe that there are things to build on, and the news is not all bleak. So if you're, you know, you come to these things to be depressed, I'm sorry if we ruin your day to end with some good news, but we feel that good news is warranted.
First of all, I want to, before I say thank you to you, I wanted to end with a quote that came from President John F. Kennedy, where he said, Israel was not created in order to disappear. Israel will endure and flourish.
Amen.
From your words, from your sage wisdom and understanding and many years of service to creating the partnerships between the United States and Israel, and also to try to fortify a sense of peace in the region, I just want to say thank you on behalf of our Beth Israel community. Thank you on behalf of Jews in San Diego and all around the world, because it's individuals like you who help to shine a light on some of the real challenging issues that we have, but also that we know that there are people at the table who are really working hard each and every day to devote their lives to bringing the Zionist dream to reality. And so, Im Tirsuin Zo Agada, if you will, there is no dream. So I thank you, Dennis, and I thank you, David, for enlightening us and sharing such wisdom and in such a beautifully spirited way. We have been enriched for that. So thank you so much. I'm sure I share with everybody in saying thank you.
Thanks for having us.
With you.